Chapter 24. Omar Khayyam mourned his disciple with the same dignity, the same resignation, and the same discreet agony as he had mourned other friends. We were drinking the same wine, but they got drunk 2 or 3 rounds before me. Anyway, how could he deny that it was the loss of the manuscript which affected him most grievously? He was certainly able to reproduce it. He remembered its every letter, but apparently he did not want to, for there is no trace of a rewritten version. It seems that Khayyam learned a wise lesson from the theft of his manuscript. He would never more try to have control over either his future or that of his poems. He left Marwa not for Al-Maut. Not once did he envisage going there, but for his hometown. It is time, he told himself, to put an end to my peregrinations. Nishabur was the first port of call in my life. Is it not within the order of things that it should also be the last? It is there that he was going to live, surrounded by relatives, a younger sister, a considerate brother-in-law, nephews, and above all, a niece who was to be the recipient of the most of tenderness of his autumn years. He was also surrounded by his books. He did not write any more, but untiringly reread the works of his masters. One day, as he was seated in his room as usual with Avicenna's book of healing on his knees, open at the chapter entitled The One and the Multiple, Omar felt a dull pain start up. He placed his golden toothpick, which he had been holding in his hand, between the leaves to mark the page, closed the book, and summoned his family in order to dictate to them his last testament. Then he uttered a prayer which finished with the words, "My God, you know that I have sought to perceive you as much as I could. Forgive me if my knowledge of you has been my only path towards you." He opened his eyes no more. It was 4th December, 1131. Omar Khayyam was in his 84th year, having been born on 18 June 1048 at daybreak. The fact that the date of birth of a person from that era is known with such precision is indeed extraordinary, but Khayyam showed an astrologer's obsession with the subject. He had most probably questioned his mother to find out his ascendant, Gemini, and to determine the position of the Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter at the hour of his coming into the world. Thus he drew up his birth chart and took care to pass it on to the chronicler Bayhaqi. Another of his contemporaries, the writer Nizam Arusi, recounted, "I met Omar Khayyam 20 years before his death in the city of Balkh. He had come to stay with one of the notables on the slave traders' road, and knowing of his fame, I shouted him in order to hear every one of his words. That is how I heard him say, 'My tomb will be in a place where the north wind scatters flowers every spring.' His words at first seemed absurd to me. However, I knew that a man like him would not speak in an unconsidered manner." The witness continued, "I passed through Nishabur 4 years after Khayyam's death. As I venerated him as one should a master of science, I made a pilgrimage to his last home. A guide led me to the cemetery. Upon turning to the left, after entering, I saw the tomb adjoining the wall of the garden. Pear and peach trees spread out their branches and had dropped so much blossom onto his sepulchre that it was hidden under a carpet of petals. A drop of water fell into the sea. A speck of dust came floating down to earth. What signifies your passage through this world? A tiny gnat appears and disappears." Omar Khayyam was wrong. Far from being as transitory as he said, his existence, or at least that of his quatrains, had just begun. But was it not for them that the poet, who dared not wish it for himself, wished immortality? Those who had the terrifying privilege at Al-Maut of being allowed in to see Hassan Sabbah did not fail to notice the silhouette of a book in a hollow niche in the wall, behind a thick wire grate. No one knew what it was, nor dared to question the supreme preacher. It was assumed that he had his reasons for not depositing it in the great library, where there were great works which contained the most unspeakable truths. When Hassan died at almost 80 years old, the lieutenant he had designated to succeed him did not dare install himself in the master's den, and even less did he dare open the mysterious grate. For a long time after the disappearance of the founder, the inhabitants of Al-Maut were terrified by the mere sight of the walls which had sheltered him. They avoided venturing toward this previously inhabited quarter, lest they come across his shade. The order was still subjected to the rules which Hassan had decreed. The community members' permanent lot was one of the strictest asceticism. There was no deviation, no pleasure, and only more violence against the outside world, more assassinations than ever, most probably to prove that the leader's death had in no way weakened his adherents' resolve. And did these adherents accept this strictness good-naturedly? Less and less. Murmurs started to be heard, not so much amongst the veterans who had won Al-Maut while Hassan was alive. They still lived in the memory of the persecutions they had undergone in their countries of origin and feared lest the slightest relaxation make them more vulnerable. However, these men were becoming less numerous every day, and the fortress was more and more inhabited by their sons and grandsons. From the cradle, all of them had been accorded the most rigorous indoctrination which forced them to learn and respect Hassan's owner's directives as if they were divine revelation. But most of them were becoming more resistant. Life was taking its claim on them again. Some dared one day to ask why they were forced to spend their whole youth in that barracks-type convent from which all joy had been banished. They were so thoroughly repressed that henceforth they guarded against uttering the slightest discordant opinion. That is, in public, for meetings started to be held secretly indoors. The young conspirators were encouraged by all those women who had seen a son, brother, or husband depart on a secret mission from which he had not returned. One man made himself the spokesman for this stifled and suppressed longing. No one else would allow himself to be put forward. He was the grandson of the man Hassan had designated as his successor, and he himself was named to become the fourth Grand Master of the order upon the death of his father. He had a distinct advantage over his predecessors. Having been born a little after the death of the founder, he had never had to live under his terror. He observed his home with curiosity and naturally with a certain amount of apprehension, but without that morbid fascination which paralyzed all the others. He had even gone into the forbidden room once, at the age of 17, had walked around it, gone up to the magic basin and dipped his hand into the icy water, then stopped in front of the niche which enclosed the manuscript. He almost opened it, but changed his mind, took a step back, and then walked backwards out of the room. He did not want to go any further on his first visit. When the heir wandered in pensive mood through the alleyways of Al-Maut, people gathered around, while not getting too close, and uttered curious formula in blessing. He was also called Hassan, like Sabah, but another name was already being whispered around him: the Redeemer, the long-awaited. Only one thing was feared, that the old guard of the assassins, who knew his feelings and who had already heard him rashly censure the prevailing atmosphere of severity, would prevent him from acceding to power. In fact, his father did try to impose silence upon him, even accusing him of being an atheist and of betraying the teaching of the founder. It was even said that he had 250 of his partisans put to death and expelled 250 others, forcing them to carry the corpses of their executed friends on their backs down to the foot of the mountain. However, due to a trace of paternal feeling, the Grand Master did not dare follow Hassan Sabah's tradition of infanticide. When the father died in 1162, the rebellious son succeeded him without the slightest hitch. For the first time in a long while, real joke broke out in the grey alleyways of Al-Maut. For the first time in a long time, real joy broke out in the grey alleyways of Al-Maut. But was it really a question of a long-awaited Redeemer? The adherents asked themselves. Was it really this man who was to put an end to their suffering? He himself said nothing. He continued to walk around distractedly in the alleyways of Al-Maut, or he spent long hours in the library under the protective eye of the copyist who was in charge of it, a man originally from Kirman. One day he was seen walking decisively toward Hassan Sabbah's former residence. He threw the door open, walked up to the niche, and shook the grate with such violence that it came away from the wall, letting a stream of sand and bits of stone pour on the floor. He lifted Al-Khayyam's manuscript, tapped the dust off it, and carried it away with him under his arms. It was then said that he shut himself up to read and to meditate until the seventh day, when he gave the order that everyone in Al-Maut, men, women, and children, should assemble in the Maidan, the only place large enough to hold them all. It was 8 August 1164. The sun of Al-Maut was beating down on their heads and the faces, but no one thought of protecting himself. Towards the west there arose a wooden dais, decked out with a huge standard, one red, one green, one yellow, and one white, at each of the four corners. It was in this direction that everyone's gaze was directed. Suddenly he appeared, dressed all in dazzling white, with his slight young wife behind him, her face unveiled, her eyes cast to the ground, and her cheeks flushed with confusion. In the crowd it seemed that his apparition dispelled the last doubts. People were boldly murmuring, "It is he! It is the Redeemer!" Solemnly he climbed the few steps to the platform and gave his faithful a warm gesture of welcome, intended to silence the murmurings. Then he went on to pronounce one of the most astonishing speeches ever heard on our planet. "To all inhabitants of the world, jinns, men, and angels," he said, "the Mahdi offers you his blessing and pardons all your sins, both past and future. He announces to you that the sacred law is abolished, for the hour of the resurrection has sounded. God imposed on you his law to make you earn paradise, and indeed you now deserve it. From today on, paradise is yours. You are thus free of the yoke of the law. Everything that was forbidden is permitted, and everything that was obligatory is forbidden. The 5 daily prayers are forbidden," the Redeemer continued. "Since we are now in paradise and in permanent contact with the Creator, we no longer have any need to address him at fixed times. Those who persist in making the 5 prayers show thereby how little they believe in the resurrection. Prayer has become an act of unbelief. On the other hand, wine, considered by the Quran to be the drink of paradise, was from now on authorized. Not to drink it was considered to be a manifest sign of a lack of faith." When this was proclaimed, a Persian historian of the time related, the assembly started to rejoice on the harp and flute and to drink wine conspicuously on the very steps of the dais. It was an excessive reaction, in proportion to the excesses practiced by Hassan Sabbah in the name of Quranic law. Soon the successors of the Redeemer would set themselves to diminishing his messianic ardor, but Al-Maut would never again be this reservoir of martyrs desired by the supreme preacher. Life would henceforth be sweet, and the long series of murders which had terrorized the cities of Islam would be interrupted. The Ismailis, as radical a sect as there ever was, would change into a community of exemplary tolerance. In fact, after having announced the good news to the people of Al-Maut and its surroundings, the Redeemer sent emissaries off to the other Ismaili communities of Asia and Egypt. They were provided with documents signed by his hand and asked everyone to celebrate the Day of Redemption, whose date they gave according to 3 different calendars: that of the Hijrah of the Prophet, that of Alexander the Greek, and that of the most eminent man of both worlds, Umar Khayyam of Nishapur. At Al-Maut, the Redeemer gave orders that the Samarkand manuscript be venerated as a great book of wisdom. Artists were commissioned to ornament it with pictures, to illuminate it, and to make it for a casket of chased gold encrusted with precious stones. No one had the right to copy its contents, but it was placed permanently on a low cedar table in the small inner room where the librarian worked. There, Under his suspicious surveillance, some privileged members would come to consult it. Until then, people knew only a few of Khayyam's quatrains, which had been composed in his impetuous youth. Now many others were learned, quoted, and repeated, some with serious alterations. This period also saw one of the strangest phenomena. Whenever a poet composed a quatrain which might cause trouble for him, he would attribute it to Umar. Hundreds of false rubayat came to be intermixed with those of Khayyam, to the extent that, in the absence of the manuscript, it was impossible to discern which were truly his. Was it the Redeemer's request that the librarian of Al-Maut, from father to son, look up the chronicle of the manuscript at the point where Vartan left it? In any case, it is from this single source that we know Khayyam's posthumous influence on the metamorphoses the assassins underwent. The concise yet irreplaceable amount of history was carried on in the same way for almost a century until a new brutal interruption, the Mongol invasions. The first wave, led by Genghis Khan, was beyond a shadow of doubt the most devastating scourge ever to cross the Orient. Important cities were razed and their population exterminated. Such was the case with Peking, Bukhara, and Samarkand, whose inhabitants were treated like cattle, with the young women handed around to the officers of the victorious horde, the artisans reduced to slavery, and the rest massacred, with the sole exception of a minority who, regrouping around the Grand Qadi of the time, very quickly proclaimed their allegiance to Genghis Khan. In spite of this apocalypse, Samarkand appeared to be almost favored, since it would one day be reborn from its rubble to become the capital of a worldwide empire, that of Tamerlane. In contrast to so many cities which were never to rise again, namely the three great metropolises of Khorasan, where all this world's intellectual activity had long been concentrated, Marwa, Balkh, and Nishapur, to which list must be added Rai, the cradle of Oriental medicine, whose very name would be forgotten. The world would have to wait several centuries in order to see the rebirth on a neighboring site of the city of Tehran. It was the second wave of Mongol invasions which swept over Al-Maut. It was a little less bloody, but more far-reaching. How can we not share the terror of the people alive at the time, knowing that the Mongol troops were able, over a period of a few months, to lay waste to Baghdad, Damascus, Krakow in Poland, and the Chinese province of Sichuan. The assassin's fortress thus opted to surrender the fortress which had resisted so many invaders over 160 years. Prince Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan, came in person to admire this masterpiece of military construction. Legend says that he found provisions which had been conserved intact from the days of Hassan Sabbah. After inspecting the place with his lieutenants, he ordered the soldiers to destroy everything, not to leave a stone untouched, not to spare even the library. However, before setting fire to it, he permitted a 30-year-old historian, a certain Juwayni, to go inside. He had been in the process of writing a history of the conqueror of the world, at Hulagu's request, which book is still today our most valuable source on the Mongol invasions. He thus was able to go into this mysterious place where tens of thousands of manuscripts were kept in rows, stacked up or rolled up. Outside, he was awaited by a Mongol officer and a soldier with a wheelbarrow. What the wheelbarrow could hold would be saved. The rest was to be the victim to the flames. There was no question of reading the text or cataloging the titles. A fervent Sunni, Juwayni told himself that his first task was to save the word of God from the fire. He started to pile up as quickly as he could any copies of the Quran, recognizable by their thick binding and stored in the same place. He had a good score of them and made 3 trips to carry them out to the wheelbarrow, which was already almost full. Now, what to choose? Heading toward one of the walls against which the volumes seemed to be better ordered than elsewhere, he came across innumerable works written by Hassan Sabbah during his 30 years of voluntary reclusion. He chose to save one of them, an autobiography of which he would quote some fragments in his own work. He also found a chronicle of Al-Maut, which was recent and apparently well documented, and which related in detail the history of the Redeemer. He hurried to take it away with him, since that episode was totally unknown outside the Ismaili community. Did the historian know of the existence of the Samarkand manuscript? It seemed not. Would he have looked for it if he had heard it spoken of? And having thumbed through it, would he have saved it? We do not know. What is told is that he stopped in front of a group of workers devoted to the occult science, and that he delved into them, forgetting the time. The Mongol officer who came to remind him with a few words had his body covered with thick red-framed armor, and had as head protection a helmet which broadened out like long hair toward the neck. He was carrying a torch in his hand, and to show just how much in a hurry he was, he placed it next to a pile of dusty scrolls. The historian gave in and gathered into his hands and up to his armpit as many as he could grab, and when the manuscript entitled Eternal Secrets of Stars and Numbers fell to the ground, he did not bend over to pick it up again. Thus it was that the assassin's library burned for 7 days and 7 nights, causing the loss of innumerable works, of which there was no copy remaining, and which are supposed to have contained the best guarded secrets in the universe. For a long time, it was believed that the Samarkand manuscript had also been consumed in the inferno of Al-Maut.